The crumpled ultrasound photograph trembled in Genevieve's fingers, just as the heavy oak doors of the study shattered inward. Dominic didn't just walk into a room. He consumed it. His dark eyes locked onto her swollen stomach, a chilling silence descending before he whispered the words that would destroy her. The sprawling, brutalist mansion in the Hudson Valley was designed to be an impenetrable fortress, a monument to the power and paranoia of the Moretti crime syndicate. For the past 5 months, however, it had been Genevieve's gilded cage. Outside, the harsh February winds whipped off the river, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass. Inside, the temperature had just dropped to absolute zero. Genevieve stood frozen near the mahogany desk, her oversized cream cashmere sweater no longer capable of hiding the undeniable curve of her abdomen. She was 22 weeks along. For months, she had played a terrifying game of optical illusions, wearing loose garments, carrying large handbags, avoiding the communal areas of the estate, and blaming her sudden weight gain and sickness on the stress of the recent gang wars in the city. Dominic Moretti, the undisputed head of the family, stood mere feet away. He was a man carved from marble and violence, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that somehow made him look even more lethal. For the last 72 hours, he had been downtown, violently dismantling a rogue faction of the O'Callahan syndicate that had tried to seize control of his Brooklyn shipping routes. He was supposed to be gone for another week. Instead, he was here, and his eyes, usually a guarded, impenetrable onyx, were currently fixed on the sonogram picture that had slipped from Genevieve's trembling fingers and fluttered to the Persian rug between them. Dominic did not shout. He did not draw the custom 1911 pistol holstered at his hip. In Dominic's world, raised voices were for the weak, for men who lacked true control. His wrath was a quiet, methodical thing, which only made it infinitely more terrifying. He stepped forward, the heel of his Italian leather shoe, stopping mere inches from the photograph. He slowly crouched down, retrieving the glossy black and white paper. The silence in the room stretched so taut that Genevieve thought she might physically shatter. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs refused to expand. He stared at the image. The date printed in the corner was undeniable. The gestational age was clearly marked, 22 weeks, 4 days. Dominic stood up, his jaw ticking, the only physical manifestation of the nuclear explosion detonating inside his mind. He looked from the photograph to her stomach, and finally, up to her pale, terrified face. The math was simple, brutally simple. 6 months ago, Dominic had been utterly removed from the board. He had been presumed dead, his armored Mercedes G-Wagon reduced to a charred husk of twisted metal and ash on the FDR Drive. The police, the rival families, and Genevieve herself had believed him to be gone. The truth that he had faked his own assassination to flush out a high-ranking informant working with the FBI was a secret he had kept even from his wife. He had spent 3 agonizing months hiding in a miserable, windowless bunker in Palermo, pulling the strings in the shadows while he watched his enemies reveal themselves. He had returned to her 3 months ago, stepping out of the shadows like a resurrected god, expecting to find his grieving widow. He had found her, pale and withdrawn, but he had assumed it was the lingering trauma of his death. They had not shared a bed in over 6 months. "I'm going to ask you a question, Genevieve," Dominic said, his voice a velvet rasp that barely carried over the howling wind outside. He stepped closer, crowding her space, the faint scent of winter air, cordite, and expensive cologne wrapping around her. "And the answer you give me will determine whether the sun rises on this house tomorrow." Tears pricked the corners of Genevieve's eyes. She backed up until her spine hit the edge of the desk. There was nowhere left to run. "Dominic, please," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Let me explain." He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. The tenderness of the gesture was violently at odds with the murder in his eyes. His thumb brushed a stray tear from her cheek. "Tell me who the father is," the Mafia boss said, his tone devoid of any emotion, empty and vast as a black hole. Genevieve's mind raced, a frantic, desperate rat trapped in a maze. If she told him the truth, a bloodbath would follow that would tear the entire East Coast underworld apart. The truth wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage vows. It was a treason that struck at the very heart of the Moretti Empire. It was a mistake," she stammered, her hands instinctively moving to cover her abdomen, a primal urge to protect the life growing inside her from the apex predator standing before them. "I was broken, Dominic. I thought you were in the ground. I had to identify a body that they told me was yours. The ring, the watch, they were yours. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I wanted to die." Dominic's expression remained entirely impassive, but his fingers tightened slightly on her jaw, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "I am well aware of the state you were in, Genevieve. My men reported back to me every single day. I know you grieved. But grief does not magically implant a child in your womb," he said smoothly. "So, I will ask you once more. Do not test my patience, because, as of this moment, I have none left." "Who?" She bit her lip, tasting copper. The name was a venom resting on her tongue. Arthur, Vincent, a stranger in a bar. She could lie. She could invent a ghost for him to chase. But Dominic was a man who owned senators, police chiefs, and an army of men who specialized in extracting the truth. A lie would only delay the inevitable and guarantee her own execution when he unraveled it. When she remained silent, tears spilling over her lashes and tracking down her cheeks, Dominic released her face. He took a deliberate step back, his eyes sweeping over her with a sudden, freezing detachment, as if she were a piece of furniture he had decided to throw away. "Lock down the estate," Dominic said loudly, not looking away from her. The door to the study, which he had left open, immediately filled with the imposing frame of Leo, his head of security. "Yes, boss." "Nobody in or out?" "Nobody," Dominic confirmed, his eyes boring into Genevieve's. "Take all the phones, cut the landlines, jam the Wi-Fi signals. No one communicates with the outside world until I say otherwise. And send my cousin up here. Now." Genevieve's heart stopped. The blood drained so rapidly from her head that the room spun. His cousin. The 10 minutes it took for Matteo Moretti to arrive felt like a century. Genevieve had collapsed into the leather armchair behind the desk, her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach, shivering uncontrollably despite the roaring fire in the hearth. Dominic had not spoken another word to her. He had walked to the wet bar, poured himself a strict 2 fingers of scotch, and stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered grounds, perfectly still. When the heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, Genevieve squeezed her eyes shut. She prayed for the ground to open up and swallow her. Matteo stepped into the study. He was 3 years younger than Dominic, possessing the same dark, striking Mediterranean features. But where Dominic was cold and calculating, Matteo was fire and charisma. He was the underboss, the golden boy of the family, the man who handled the labor unions, the ports, and the politicians, with a charming smile and a velvet-gloved iron fist. He was also the man who had held Genevieve while she screamed on the floor the night she was told her husband was dead. "You called, Dom?" Matteo asked, his deep voice carrying a casual confidence. He stepped fully into the room, wearing a tailored navy suit, brushing a few flakes of snow from his shoulders. He glanced at Genevieve, offering her a brief, reassuring smile, before his eyes darted back to his cousin. He didn't know yet. Genevieve had avoided him entirely for the past 4 months. She had pleaded sickness, exhaustion, anxiety, anything to stay locked in her wing of the house. Matteo thought she was just still recovering from the shock of Dominic's resurrection. Dominic didn't turn around immediately. He took a slow sip of his scotch, the ice clinking loudly against the crystal glass. "Sit down, Matteo," Dominic commanded. Matteo's casual demeanor faltered slightly at the absolute zero in Dominic's voice. As a man who had grown up in the trenches of organized crime, his survival instincts were razor-sharp. He sensed the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. He walked over to the sofa opposite the desk and sat, his posture instantly rigid. Dominic finally turned. He placed his glass down on the polished mahogany with a heavy thud. Then, he picked up the ultrasound photograph and tossed it across the room. It fluttered in the air before landing on the glass coffee table, right in front of Matteo. "My wife Dominic," began, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register, "is 22 weeks pregnant." Genevieve watched Matteo's face. She watched the exact moment his world collapsed. For a fraction of a second, his dark eyes widened, fixating on the black and white image of the fetus. His jaw went completely slack. He knew the timeline. He knew exactly what had happened 22 weeks ago. It had been the darkest night of both their lives. It was the 2-month anniversary of Dominic's death. Genevieve had been drinking heavy red wine, trying to numb the relentless agony. Matteo had come to check on her, as he did every night. He had been exhausted, bearing the weight of holding the entire fractured syndicate together while the capos circled like vultures. They had started talking about Dominic. Then they started crying. Then, in a blur of desperate grief, shared trauma, and a desperate primal need to feel something other than pain, the lines had blurred. It was a single, catastrophic collision on the very sofa Matteo was currently sitting on. They had woken up the next morning sick with guilt, swearing to take the secret to their graves. And then, a month later, Dominic came back from the dead. Matteo was an exceptional liar. He had to be, to survive in their world. But this was a blow he hadn't braced for. It took everything in him to mask the sudden, terrifying realization. But Genevieve saw the subtle, micro-tremor in his hands before he forced them into fists resting on his knees. "Dom." Matteo started, his voice thick. He cleared his throat, forcing a mask of deep concern onto his face. "Dom, what are you saying?" "I am saying," Dominic stated, pacing slowly toward his cousin like a panther circling a tethered goat, "that for the last 6 months I have been dead to the world, which means the child growing inside my wife's belly does not share my blood. Someone touched what is mine." Matteo looked up at Dominic, feigning the righteous fury expected of a loyal underboss. "Who?" he demanded, his voice hardening, though Genevieve could hear the hollow, desperate edge to it. "Tell me who, Dom. I'll peel his skin off while he breathes." Genevieve felt a wave of nausea so violent she had to grip the arms of the chair. The psychological warfare playing out in front of her was unbearable. Matteo was actively signing his own death warrant, playing a role, desperately trying to deflect the suspicion that hadn't even been aimed at him yet. "That is exactly what I need you to find out," Dominic said, stopping directly in front of Matteo. He looked down at his cousin, his expression unreadable. "She refuses to speak. She thinks her silence protects him." Dominic turned his gaze to Genevieve, his eyes stripping her bare. "She thinks I am blind to her loyalties, but she is just a scared woman. The man, however, the man who took advantage of a grieving widow, who walked into my house, ate my food, and defiled my marriage bed while I was supposedly rotting in hell." Dominic's voice finally cracked, just a fraction, revealing a bottomless reservoir of rage beneath the ice. "That man is a dead man walking. He just doesn't know it yet." Matteo stood up, meeting Dominic's gaze flawlessly. "I will tear the city apart, boss. I'll interrogate the security detail. I'll pull the server logs, the camera feeds, the phone records. If a ghost walked into this estate 22 weeks ago, I will find his shadow. Do it, Dominic ordered. I want a name by midnight. And Matteo? Matteo paused at the door, his hand on the brass handle. Yeah, Dom? When you find him, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed loudly in the quiet room. Don't kill him. Bring him to the basement. I want to look into the eyes of the man who thought he could steal my legacy, right before I take everything from him. Understood, Matteo said softly. He didn't look at Genevieve as he walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. The click of the latch sounded like the firing pin of a gun. Genevieve was left alone with her husband. The hunter had just unknowingly commanded the prey to find itself. And as Dominic turned his dark, brooding gaze back to her, Genevieve realized the true horror of her situation. Matteo would not throw himself upon Dominic's sword. To save his own life, Matteo was going to have to frame someone else. And she was going to have to watch an innocent man die, or confess and watch the entire family burn. The server room in the sub-basement of the estate was a chilled, windowless vault humming with the sound of a dozen cooling fans. Matteo locked the heavy steel door behind him, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted for miles. The sophisticated facade he wore for the men upstairs had completely evaporated, leaving only the frantic, pulsing terror of a cornered animal. He had hours. Less than hours, really. Dominic was a human lie detector. If Matteo walked back into that study with empty hands, Dominic's razor-sharp paranoia would inevitably turn toward his own blood. He needed a scapegoat, and he needed one fast enough to preempt any independent investigation Dominic might launch. Matteo paced the narrow aisle between the server racks, scrolling feverishly through his phone. Who was close enough to Genevieve during those months? Who had the clearance to bypass the primary security checkpoints without drawing immediate fire? His thumb stopped on a name, Declan Gallagher. Declan was a 24-year-old enforcer from the Irish factions in South Boston, brought in as extra muscle during the O'Callaghan dispute. When Dominic died, Matteo had assigned Declan to be Genevieve's personal driver and shadow. He was young, undeniably handsome, in a rough, bruised sort of way, and had possessed the fatal flaw of being overly sympathetic to the grieving widow. Dominic had quietly dismissed the kid 2 weeks after returning from the dead, claiming he didn't like the lingering, pitiful way Declan looked at his wife. It was the perfect narrative. The grieving widow and the sympathetic bodyguard. It was a cliché, which meant it was entirely believable. Matteo moved to the master terminal. He wasn't a hacker, but he had top-tier clearance. He summoned Harrison, the estate's lead cybersecurity technician, a nervous, asthmatic kid who owed his life to the Moretti family after racking up a six-figure gambling debt. When Harrison arrived, looking pale and terrified by the sudden summons, Matteo didn't waste time. He drew his tailored suit jacket back, just enough to reveal the grip of his pistol. I need you to alter the digital footprint from October 12th, Matteo ordered, his voice a low, dangerous hum. I want security footage scrubbed from the West Wing corridor between midnight and 4 a.m. And I want an encrypted text log generated between Genevieve's old burner phone and Declan Gallagher's number. Make it look like they were arranging a blind spot. Harrison swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the gun. Matteo, boss. Dominic audits these servers. If he finds a splice in the footage, if you don't do it, you won't live long enough to worry about an audit, Matteo hissed, grabbing the technician by the collar of his flannel shirt and slamming him against the metal rack. Do it. Leave a faint trail. Make it look like Declan tried to wipe it but was too sloppy. Dominic likes to think he's the smartest man in the room. Let him find the breadcrumbs. Upstairs, in the master suite, Genevieve was losing her mind. The heavy deadbolt had clicked shut from the outside over an hour ago. She was trapped in 3,000 square feet of opulence, pacing the hardwood floors until her feet ached. The silence of the lockdown was suffocating. She knew the mechanics of the Moretti family better than anyone. A lockdown meant no one slept, and usually someone died. She walked into the expansive marble bathroom and gripped the edges of the vanity, staring at her pale reflection. The curve of her stomach pressed against the cold stone counter. Mateo's child. Panic seized her throat. Mateo was a survivor. He had clawed his way up the ranks by outsmarting and outbrutalizing men twice his age. He would never walk into Dominic's study and confess to sleeping with the boss's wife. He would deflect. Who will he use? She thought, her mind racing through the roster of soldiers, guards, and associates. Declan. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Declan had been kind to her. He had brought her hot tea when she couldn't sleep. He had driven her to the cliffs overlooking the river so she could cry in peace. He was a good kid who sent half his paycheck back to his mother and disabled sister in Massachusetts. Mateo knew Dominic already harbored a quiet, irrational jealousy toward the boy. Genevieve sank to the tiled floor, pulling her knees to her chest. If Mateo framed Declan, Dominic would dismantle the boy piece by piece. He wouldn't just kill him, he would make an example of him. And if Genevieve tried to defend him, Dominic would simply assume she was trying to protect her lover, sealing Declan's fate even faster. She had to get out of the room. She had to intercept Mateo before he presented his poisoned evidence. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the bedroom telephone, picking up the receiver. Dead air. The landlines were cut. She checked her cell phone. No service blinked mockingly in the corner of the screen. The Wi-Fi jammers were fully operational. Genevieve went to the massive oak door and pounded her fists against the wood. "Let me out!" she screamed, her voice tearing at her throat. "Leo, open this door!" There was no answer, just the echoing silence of a tomb waiting to be filled. She slid down the wood, burying her face in her hands. The clock on the mantel ticked relentlessly toward midnight, each second a countdown to a massacre. At 11:45 p.m., the heavy iron door of the sub-basement interrogation room groaned open. The air down here was thick, smelling of old copper, damp concrete, and the distinct metallic tang of fear. Dominic stood in the center of the room, his suit jacket discarded, his crisp white shirt sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He was methodically polishing a silver brass knuckle with a microfiber cloth. Strapped to a heavy steel chair in the center of the room, illuminated by a harsh, swinging overhead bulb, was Declan Gallagher. The boy's face was already a ruin. His left eye was swollen shut, his lips split in 3 places, and blood stained the collar of his cheap Henley shirt. He was shivering violently, coughing up pink froth onto his chest. Footsteps echoed on the concrete stairs. Mateo emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of grim determination. He held a manila folder in his hands. 2 of his loyal enforcers followed behind him, dragging a stumbling, hyperventilating Genevieve. When Genevieve saw Declan, a broken sob ripped from her throat. She tried to lunge forward, but the enforcers held her fast, forcing her to stand against the cold concrete wall. "Dominic, stop!" she cried out. "He didn't do anything! Please, God, let him go!" Dominic didn't look at her. He kept his dark eyes fixed on Declan. He slipped the brass knuckles over his right hand, the metal gleaming maliciously under the stark light. "She has a very soft heart, my wife," Dominic murmured, his voice echoing off the walls. He turned his head slowly to look at Mateo. "Did you find what I asked for, cousin?" Mateo stepped forward, opening the folder. He didn't look at Genevieve. He couldn't. "It took some digging, boss," Mateo said, his voice steady, projecting the perfect blend of disgust and loyalty. Harrison found a spliced loop in the security feed for the West Wing corridor from October 12th. He managed to recover the deleted metadata. Declan entered her private suite at 1:15 a.m. and didn't leave until just before dawn. We also pulled encrypted burner texts. They were coordinating. Declan weakly lifted his head, spitting blood onto the floor. "It's a lie," he rasped, his thick Boston accent slurred from a broken jaw. "I swear on my mother's soul, Mr. Moretti, I never touched her. I was at the perimeter gate that night. Check the rotation logs." "I did," Matteo snapped back, stepping closer to the boy. "And you paid off the guard on duty to cover your sector." He handed the manila folder to Dominic. "It's all there in black and white, Dom. He's the one." Dominic took the folder. He didn't open it. He simply held it in his left hand, the heavy brass knuckles resting on his right. He walked over to Genevieve, towering over her. The sheer, suffocating menace rolling off him made the air in the room feel completely devoid of oxygen. "Is this the man?" Dominic asked her, his voice barely a whisper. "Look at him, Genevieve. Look at the father of your bastard, and tell me this is the man you replaced me with." Genevieve looked at Declan's destroyed face. The boy was staring at her, his one good eye pleading with her, begging for a salvation she couldn't give him without destroying herself. She looked at Matteo, standing rigidly by the chair, his jaw set, his eyes burning into hers with a silent, desperate threat. "Go along with it. Survive." Genevieve felt the bile rise in her throat. She had been raised in this brutal world, but she had never fully surrendered her soul to it. She could not let this boy be tortured to death. "Dominic," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she cupped her stomach. "Dominic, please. The logs are fake. The texts are fake." Matteo's face paled. "She's trying to protect him, Dom. She loves him." "No!" Genevieve screamed, finding a sudden, terrifying surge of courage. She locked eyes with her husband. "I'm not protecting him. I'm telling you the truth. Declan was never in my room." Dominic tilted his head, his dark eyes analyzing her with a terrifying lack of emotion. "If it wasn't the boy, then who?" Genevieve drew a ragged breath. She looked at Matteo. Matteo's hands subtly dropped toward his waistband, his survival instincts screaming, realizing the frame job was falling apart. Before Genevieve could utter the name, Dominic did something that froze the blood in everyone's veins. He smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the chilling, terrifying baring of teeth from a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Dominic slowly turned away from Genevieve and faced his underboss. "You see, Matteo," Dominic said, his voice ringing with a sudden, deadly clarity. "I find it fascinating that you managed to uncover this highly encrypted digital evidence so quickly, especially since I personally fired Declan Gallagher 3 months ago and revoked all his digital access the very same day." Matteo froze. The air in the room vanished. "Dom, what are you? What am I saying?" Dominic took a slow, deliberate step toward his cousin. He dropped the manila folder on the floor, letting the forged documents scatter across the bloody concrete. "I am saying that I didn't spend 3 months in a bunker in Palermo just hiding from the O'Callahans. I spent it watching my own house. I watched who mourned me. I watched who moved to take my power." Dominic took another step, the brass knuckles glinting. "And I had hidden cameras installed in my wife's private suite long before my car exploded. Cameras that don't run on the main server, cameras that Harrison knows absolutely nothing about." Genevieve gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Matteo's face drained of all color, turning the shade of old parchment. The realization of his absolute, inescapable doom crashed over him. He had walked right into a flawlessly executed trap. "So, imagine my surprise," Dominic continued, his voice dropping to a low, guttural snarl as he closed the distance to Matteo, when I reviewed the offline backups upon my return. "Imagine what I saw on the night of October 12th on that sofa. Matteo didn't speak. He didn't try to explain. He knew there was no talking his way out of a grave. Dominic had already dug for him. In a blur of desperate motion, Matteo drew his pistol, aiming squarely for Dominic's chest. But Dominic was the apex predator for a reason. Before Matteo could even level the barrel, Dominic surged forward with terrifying speed, his right hand flashing out in a brutal arc. The brass knuckles connected with Matteo's temple, with the sickening sound of fracturing bone. The sickening sound of metal crushing bone echoed through the subterranean vault, a horrific punctuation mark to the end of a dynasty. Matteo didn't even have time to register the pain before his vision exploded into white noise. He crumpled to the concrete like a puppet with its strings severed, the heavy, customized Glock skittering uselessly across the floor and coming to a rest against Dominic's immaculate leather shoe. For a terrifying second, the two enforcers who had accompanied Matteo instinctively reached for their own weapons, but they froze instantly. From the shadows of the stairwell, Leo emerged, a suppressed submachine gun leveled with lethal precision at their chests. 6 more of Dominic's most fiercely loyal soldiers materialized behind him, their weapons drawn and steady. The room had been secured long before Matteo even opened the door. Dominic didn't spare the enforcers a single glance. He stood over his bleeding, semi-conscious cousin, methodically peeling the brass knuckles from his right hand. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket, wiped the metal clean, and dropped the cloth onto Matteo's chest. "You thought this was just about my wife?" Dominic's voice was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the estate. He crouched down, grabbing Matteo by the collar of his ruined suit, hauling him halfway off the floor so they were eye to eye. "You thought I set this elaborate stage just to punish you for slipping into my bed while you thought I was rotting in the ground?" Matteo coughed, a thick spray of crimson painting his lips. He tried to focus his eyes on Dominic, the sheer paralyzing terror finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "October 12th was an insult, Matteo," Dominic whispered, his tone terrifyingly conversational. "It was a pathetic, predictable moment of weakness between a grieving widow and an opportunistic coward. But September 4th, the day my convoy was ambushed on the FDR, that was treason." Genevieve stopped breathing. She pressed herself flat against the cold concrete wall, her mind desperately trying to process the magnitude of the revelation. "I traced the offshore accounts, cousin," Dominic continued, his grip tightening until Matteo's face began to turn a bruised purple. "I found the wire transfers from Liam O'Callaghan. I found the burner phone you used to feed them my exact route. You didn't just sleep with my wife, Matteo. You tried to murder me to take my throne." Matteo let out a choked, wet gasp. The ultimate betrayal had been laid bare. There was no deflection left, no scapegoat to frame. He had gambled the entire Moretti Empire, and he had lost to a man who saw every angle before the dice were even rolled. Dominic released him, letting Matteo collapse back onto the unforgiving floor in a pathetic heap. He stood up, smoothing the front of his shirt with terrifying calm. He turned his attention to Leo. "Take him to the soundproof holding cell at the docks," Dominic ordered, his eyes dead and unfeeling. "Keep him awake. The O'Callaghan's have a shipment of weapons coming into Port Newark tomorrow night. Matteo is going to tell us exactly which container it is. And then he is going to tell us every single name in our organization that helped him orchestrate the hit on me." "And after he talks, boss?" Leo asked, his voice entirely devoid of pity, as he signaled 2 men to drag Matteo by his arms. "After he talks," Dominic said, watching his cousin being dragged toward the heavy iron door, "you chain him to the engine block of that rusted freighter sitting in the dry dock, and you sink it in the deepest part of the Atlantic. Erase him from this earth." Matteo tried to scream, to beg, but his shattered jaw only produced a horrifying guttural wheeze before the steel door slammed shut, sealing his fate forever. Silence descended upon the interrogation room, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the ragged, painful breathing of Declan Gallagher, still strapped to the steel chair. Dominic walked over to the young Irishman. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket, the sharp snick of the blade echoing loudly. Genevieve flinched, but Dominic simply leaned down and sliced through the thick zip ties binding Declan's wrists and ankles. Declan slumped forward, catching himself on his bruised hands. He looked up at Dominic, entirely bewildered. "You were a pawn, Gallagher," Dominic said, his tone softening only a fraction, though it remained cold enough to freeze water. "My cousin used your sympathy for my wife to build a convenient narrative. I knew you were innocent. I just needed him to bring me the forged evidence to prove his own guilt." Dominic pulled a thick, tightly banded stack of $100 bills from his jacket pocket and tossed it into Declan's lap. "There is $50,000 in there. My men will drive you to a private airfield in Teterboro. You will be on a chartered flight to Dublin before sunrise. You will take your mother and your sister, and you will buy a quiet life in Ireland. If I ever hear your name in New York again, or if you ever breathe a word of what happened in this basement, I won't send my men. I will come for you myself. Do you understand?" Declan clutched the money, his swollen eye wide with raw, disbelieving gratitude. "Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Moretti. I swear to God you'll never see me again." Dominic nodded once, signaling the remaining guards to escort the battered boy out. Suddenly, Genevieve was alone with her husband. The monstrous reality of the night crashed down upon her. She was carrying the child of the man who had just been sentenced to a watery grave, the man who had orchestrated Dominic's assassination. She fell to her knees, the cold concrete biting into her skin, her hands wrapping protectively around her stomach. She prepared herself for the bullet, for the knife, for the final, brutal end to her gilded nightmare. Dominic walked toward her, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He stopped right in front of her, the toes of his shoes touching her knees. He reached down, his large hands gripping her upper arms, and hauled her to her feet with surprising gentleness. He looked at her tear-streaked face, his thumb reaching out to wipe away a drop of blood that had splashed onto her cheek from Matteo. "You are my wife, Genevieve," Dominic stated, his voice a complex tapestry of dark possession, lingering fury, and an immovable, terrifying loyalty. "In the eyes of the law, the church, and this city, you belong to me." "Dominic, I didn't know," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I swear to you, I didn't know what Matteo did to you, if I had known." "I know you didn't," Dominic interrupted softly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "If I believed for a single second that you were complicit in the hit, you would be in the trunk of a car right now. You were a victim of your own grief and of a master manipulator. But your weakness brought this vulnerability into my house." He placed a heavy, warm hand flat against the swell of her stomach. Genevieve shuddered, anticipating violence, but his touch remained firm, almost protective. "This child," Dominic declared, the finality in his voice absolute, "will never know the name Matteo. This child will be born under my roof. He will carry the Moretti name. He will be raised with my discipline, my resources, and my legacy. The world will see him as my heir, a symbol of my absolute, unshakable power." Genevieve stared at him, the horrifying brilliance of his punishment slowly dawning on her. He wasn't going to kill her. He was going to consume her entirely. "And you, Genevieve," Dominic whispered, leaning in until his lips brushed her ear, sealing her fate with a chilling, inescapable vow, "will spend the rest of your life standing by my side, playing the perfect, devoted wife. You will raise this child to love me, and you will wake up every single morning knowing exactly what it cost to keep you both alive." He stepped back, offering her his arm with mocking, aristocratic, flawless manners. The monster had reclaimed his castle, eliminated his Judas, and secured his heir in one brutal, calculated sweep. Genevieve looked at the arm offered to her. She had survived the night, but she realized with terrifying clarity that she had just traded a temporary nightmare for a lifelong, beautifully curated prison. Taking a trembling breath, she placed her hand on his arm, stepping out of the blood-stained basement and walking back up into the gilded cage from which she would never, ever escape. The truth, buried under layers of grief and deception, ultimately served as the architect of Matteo's demise and Genevieve's lifelong captivity. Dominic Moretti proved that true power does not merely destroy its enemies, it absorbs their betrayals, transforming treason into a chilling testament of salvation came with an inescapable price, living forever in the shadow of the monster who owned her completely.